What are some of dark events happened in history not many people know about? The ideal maternity home here in Canada. From the 1920s till the 1940s, they took in babies from unwed mothers, and they were selling them especially to desperate Jewish families in New Jersey. Adoption was illegal in the US back then. It was later discovered that the people who ran this business would starve the unmarketable babies by feeding them only molasses and water. The babies would last around 2 weeks on this diet. They put the corpses in wooden box often used for butter, and that's why the victims are called the butterbox babies. The boxes were either buried on the property or at sea or burned in the home furnace. The parents who gave their child to this maternity home would go back and see how their child is doing, but were told the child has died when in fact it had been sold to adopting parents. Between 400 and 600 died in that home, and at least 1,000 were adopted, but sadly, the adopted babies often suffered from diseases because of the unsanitary conditions and lack of care at the home. The New London School Explosion. On the afternoon of March 18, 1937, the shop teacher at the school in New London, Texas turned on an electric sander. Unbeknownst to him, there was a massive natural gas leak under the school. The sander sparked, which ignited the gas and caused a massive explosion that killed almost 300 students and teachers. It was absolutely horrific. The force of the explosion was so great that a 2-ton block of concrete crushed a car parked 200 feet away. This event is actually why natural gas has a smell now. They started adding it after the explosion so that something like this couldn't ever happen again. My grandfather was actually one of the survivors of the explosion. He never talked about it, even to his own family, so I didn't really know too much about it, other than the fact that he'd survived, until after his death. Toward the end of his life, he'd suffered a series of strokes that left him pretty physically incapacitated, so my dad had given him a voice-activated tape recorder and suggested maybe he could record his memoirs for his grandkids to listen to someday. As it turns out, he did. We have hours and hours of cassette tapes of him telling the story of his, actually very interesting, life, including a big section on the New London School explosion. For the sake of everyone's privacy, I'll call my grandfather Papa and use an initial for anyone else. Papa was in 8th grade when it happened, in his English class at about 3 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. At the beginning of class, Papa and his buddy T had been messing around and being loud in the back of the classroom, as 8th grade boys often do. His teacher, Miss M, had enough of their disruptions and made Papa switch seats with another student. He moved into the girl's desk in the front row, and she moved back into his desk in the back of the room. When the school exploded, they were taking a test on the book Ivanhoe. Papa was knocked out for a short time, and when he woke up, he couldn't see anything because the dust was so thick. He looked down and saw that his pencil had blown clear through his hand. When the dust cleared, he saw that the whole back of the room was gone. I won't go into details, but there were bodies, and parts of bodies, everywhere. The students in the front half of the room survived. The students in the back half did not. That included Papa's friend T and the little girl who'd been forced to take Papa's desk because of his misbehavior at the beginning of class. If he hadn't been acting up, he would have been killed and she would have lived. He carried the guilt of her death until the day he died. Papa's classroom was on the 2nd floor. There wasn't any way to get to the room other than the open cavity of the explosion. After the few seconds of initial shock wore off, he and another classmate jumped into action. They were the only 2 kids in the class who hadn't been badly injured. They made a tourniquet out of a sock and a shoelace for a girl with a severe injury to her arm and dug out their teacher, who was alive, but badly injured. By then, men were running up underneath the hole, so Papa and the other boys started lowering the injured to them. Then those who could walk, including Papa, climbed down. He ran off to look for his older brother, B, to see if he was okay. As it turned out, B had been supposed to be in geometry class. However, he and his buddy had snuck out to go fishing. The explosion happened as they were opening the door to head out to the parking lot. The force of the blast sent them tumbling head over foot across the lot. They were both banged up and dazed, but they survived. The rest of their geometry class was killed. I don't know that there's a moral in the fact that both my grandfather and his brother survived because they were misbehaving that day. I do know that it weighed very heavily on both of them for the rest of their lives. There's a lot more to his story about the day and the aftermath, most of it absolutely horrific, but I won't go into all of it here. A few small tidbits though. Papa and the boy who helped him rescue the other students from their classroom were both awarded medals and certificates of valor for their actions that day. Nearly every family in town lost a child, some all of their children. I'm sure you can imagine the extreme toll this took on everyone's mental health. Papa described New London in the months following the explosion as a town with no children. To help with the healing process, the oil companies actively recruited families with kids to transfer in, so that there was some sense of normalcy when school started again in the fall. Papa had played French horn in the school band. However, when school started up again, he was asked to switch to trumpet, as the entire trumpet section had been killed. A few years later, my grandfather went on to fight in World War II, and he saw some of the worst conflict in the Pacific, including Polilliu and the liberation of Manila. But he said that nothing he saw during the war was ever as bad as what he saw the day of the explosion. I'm always amazed that more people don't know about it. It was major international news at the time. Edit, holy cow. I'm overwhelmed by the amount of interest this has brought. Thank you for all of the awards and comments. To address a couple of things people mentioned in the comments. There is a small museum at the site of the explosion in New London. If you're ever out that way, I do recommend checking it out. It is very well done and incredibly moving. My grandfather's story, while amazing, is just one of many that day. A couple people mentioned the telegram from Hitler. Yes, it's there at the museum. This was a few years before he came into full power, but he was an up-and-coming political figure in Germany at the time. I looked it up online. The original is in German, but the translation reads, "On the occasion of the terrible explosion at New London, Tex, which took so many young lives, I want to assure your excellency of my and the German people's sincere sympathy. Adolf Hitler, German Reichschancellor." I don't know the details, but I do know from some things my grandmother said, that Papa had some PTSD, both from the explosion and the war. We did get the recordings converted to digital files, which we have stored in several safe locations. A number of years ago I undertook the project of transcribing everything and putting together a book of my grandfather's total memoirs. In addition to the school explosion, he really lived a fascinating life. As a little kid, he was present for one of the most famous circus disasters of all time, the Corsicana Elephant Rampage, and he saw some of the fiercest action in the Pacific as an engineer for the Army Air Force during WW2. He also went from being the dirt poor son of an oil field worker to a pretty successful salesman. Later in life, at the same time my dad went to graduate school, Papa decided to go back to school and get his master's as well, which led to a career shift to become a college professor, and he taught in both Louisiana and Hong Kong. He was really a very interesting guy. Sadly, he had his 2 strokes when I was pretty young, and he died when I was 14, so all of my memories of him are of a pretty ill man in a wheelchair. Working on transcribing his memoirs, I feel like I got to know him better after his death than I ever did in life. I am so thankful for that. I compiled the memoirs into a book that we published just for family members. In addition to my grandfather's personal photographs, he kept a camera with him all throughout the war. There are a number of pictures that I pulled from online, so we couldn't publish it as it is due to copyright issues. But maybe someday I will go back and reformat everything to submit to the Library of Congress or for wider distribution. You want a happy story about him to help counter the explosion? This is a good one. Smiley face. At the start of WW2, while he was in basic training, a girl named Kitty sent her brother, Keith, a goofy picture of herself splashing around in the creek behind their family farm in TX. The picture of Kitty caught the attention of Keith's bunkmate, Papa, who decided to write Kitty a smart alecky note of his own, jokingly criticizing her manners for showing her ugly bare feet in public. Kitty was not amused. She wrote him a scathing letter, and received a very apologetic note from Papa in response. This began a written correspondence that continued throughout the war. Papa wrote faithfully from some of the most remote, dangerous locations in the Pacific. She sent him news of the home front and taunted him with descriptions of fried chicken dinners. He sent her pictures of crocodiles and told her of the orphan children he cared for after the liberation of Manila. When Papa came back to the U.S. in 1946, he made a trip out to the farm to see his old friend Keith and to finally meet Kitty face to face. That was on a Friday. They were engaged the following Wednesday and were happily married for over 50 years. The story of Hisashi Aoki and the Tokemura incident. He was an employee at the Tokemura nuclear plant, and there was a disaster which led to him being exposed to nearly twice what is considered deadly in terms of gamma radiation, 17 sieverts. For reference, at the plant the workers were limited to 50 MSV of exposure yearly. So Aoki got 340 years worth of safe exposure over the course of a few minutes. The levels have also been compared to what may have been present at the epicenter of the Hiroshima explosion. Aoki was kept alive, against his will, for 83 days. He was just a shell of flesh and bone and completely lucid for about the first week, enduring pain and suffering most of us could never imagine. He asked doctors to let him die, and they didn't. They just prolonged his suffering, and now we know what happens to the body when exposed to extreme levels of radiation. Your organs literally melt, your skin falls off, and it's worse than any horror movie. This was in 1999. And the order for nearby residents and businesses to evacuate wasn't sent out for nearly 12 hours. The Halifax explosion. Regarded by many as the biggest man-made explosion prior to the invention of the atomic bomb. A ship laden with explosives collided with another vessel in Halifax Harbor. The resulting explosion flattened much of the city's downtown core, killing roughly 2,000 and injuring 9,000. The blast is said to have temporarily displaced the water in the harbor, forming a tsunami that reached up to 15 meters high, surging over the wreckage of the waterfront. The following day, Halifax was hit by a blizzard that dumped 40 centimeters of snow on top of the city, further complicating rescue efforts. The city is also home to a cemetery where many victims of the Titanic were laid to rest. It is said that the body identification system developed at the time of the Titanic sinking in 1912 aided efforts to identify victims of the Halifax explosion in 1917. The sad case of Oda Benga. He was a pygmy boy from the Congo who was essentially captured and brought to the USA to be displayed in freak shows. He had undergone tribal customs such as having his teeth filed into points before his capture. He eventually got out of the carnivals and dreamed of returning to Africa. Then World War I happened, making the trip impossible for the foreseeable future. He committed suicide by gunshot. In my family's region in Africa they used to carry out the death penalty by snakebite. Just a snakebite to each ankle, and then letting the man spend his remaining time with his family before he died, under supervision. I thought it sounded sort of humane in a way, like our lethal injections, but apparently they say it was one of the most horrific ways that existed. The most horrific part is that your family watches this death. Letting the man spend his remaining time with his family here really means making him die a slow agonizing death in front of his family. The death of Roger Williamson, at the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix. In the 1970s era of Formula One, the cars weren't far off from being an overpriced metal coffin on wheels, surrounded by highly flammable fuel, and during the Dutch Grand Prix, this became painfully obvious indeed. Roger Williamson crashed out after a tire puncture, and his car came to rest upside down, with him trapped inside. He was not seriously hurt by the crash, but then the fuel tank ignited and the car burst into flames. Another driver named David Pulley was behind Williamson when the crash occurred, and he saw the whole crash unfold. Pulley stopped his car on the other side of the track, ran across an active racetrack, and proceeded to try and save Williamson's life. This is where the dark part of it comes in, and depending on your sensibilities, downright outrageous and disgraceful. None of the trackside marshals had any fireproof equipment, which prevented any of them from helping Pulley to right the burning car. They also had a grand total of one fire extinguisher between them, which was incapable of putting out the flames. Additionally, not a single other driver who saw the calamity stopped to help, despite Pulley's frantic waving to them, to try and get anyone to assist in saving Williamson's life. Meanwhile, race control decided not to halt the race despite a flaming wreck being present on track, and it took almost 10 minutes before the fire engine arrived on site, by which point, Williamson had asphyxiated from the smoke and flames. As soon as the fire was out, they simply put a blanket over the burned-out car and continued racing. Later on, other drivers and the race controllers would claim that they assumed Williamson's car was actually Pulley's, and that there was no one at risk at that time, something that the many hundreds of people within the grandstands would strongly disagree with. Yeah, Williamson burned to death right in front of a grandstand packed with spectators, who all got a front row seat to watching Williamson die before their very eyes. So there you have it, a young, promising driver slowly being burnt alive over the course of 10 minutes, a second driver desperately trying in vain to save his life, a group of marshals woefully under-equipped for the job, indifferent drivers, incompetent race control, and a disaster which shook Formula One to its core. As a result of this debacle, changes were made to try and avoid this type of event occurring again in the future. The biggest change was the mandate that marshals should wear fireproof clothing, and it was also noted that drivers were more willing to stop at accident sites to assist in rescuing fellow drivers. This was most clearly seen during the 1976 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring Nordschleife, where Guy Edwards, Harold Ertl, Brett Lunger and Arturo Merzario all pulled over to assist in getting Niki Lauda out of his burning Ferrari, after the infamous crash that took him out of the German, Austrian, and Dutch Grands Prix. Anyone who's familiar with Mary, Queen of Scots, most likely knows that she was beheaded, but many people don't know how she was beheaded. My Apush teacher told my class this story, and it's probably one of the most simultaneously interesting, funniest, and saddest executions in history. The first thing to note was that Mary wore a red dress rather than a white one for a very specific reason. After the execution of a royal or high-class person, commoners would often tear off blood-stained fabric from their clothing solely to flex that they got their hands on the blood of a noble. With red fabric, it would be difficult to see actual blood on the dress. Smart move on Mary's end. During the actual execution, it was said that Mary's executioner was not very experienced and actually missed the initial swing, jamming the axe or whatever weapon they used into the back of her head rather than through her neck. This didn't kill her yet, though, and she instead made some sort of medieval olden-time exclamation that can be roughly translated to "God damn." After the executioner was done, he picked up her head by the hair, not knowing it was a wig, and the head fell out and rolled onto the floor. Thanks plug_5 and Moyochi for reminding me. After Mary was properly killed, her body was left for public viewing, but the audience was surprised to see her red dress start to rustle before allowing Mary's small terrier dog to climb out from underneath. Tragically, the dog refused to leave the body and eventually passed away after staying at the same spot for a lengthy amount of time. History buffs, please feel free to make any corrections, as I heard this story a while ago and probably made a few errors in my recalling. Smiley face. TLDR, Mary, Queen of Scots avoided crazy memorabilia savers at her execution with a very intelligent move, got shanked in the head during a failed attempt. The executioner dropped her head onto the floor, and had her dog in her dress with her the entire time.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.